My daughter begged me never to go to that farm before she died, but when I finally went there, I discovered she had been murdered and the killer was living in my house. My name is Margaret. I'm 73 years old, and I thought I knew what grief felt like when I buried my husband 15 years ago. I was wrong. Nothing prepares you for burying your only child. Helena was everything to me. My beautiful, brilliant daughter, who became a successful businesswoman, married Daniela, and gave me Sophia, my precious 15-year-old granddaughter. For decades, our life seemed perfect from the outside. Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings filled with laughter, but there was always one shadow over our happiness. Ever since Helena was a little girl, she would beg me with tears in her eyes never to visit a place called Vale dos Pinheiros farm. She'd wake up from nightmares about that place, telling me that only bad things happened there. I never understood why, but I respected her wishes. A mother protects her child's peace, even when she doesn't understand the reason. Then, Helena died suddenly at 42, heart failure, they said. The same condition that took my husband. 3 days after her funeral, the lawyer Dr. Santos handed me a set of rusty keys and told me that Vale dos Pinheiros now belonged to me. The very place my daughter had forbidden me from ever seeing was now mine. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong, and I was right. Because when I finally drove down that winding road and opened that iron gate, I found something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my daughter's death, my family, and the people I trusted most in this world. This is the story of how a 73-year-old grandmother discovered that age doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise enough to see the truth that everyone else is hiding, and believe me, the truth I found was darker than anything I could have imagined. If you want to know how a mother fights back when everyone thinks she's just a grieving old woman, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, because this story has more twists than that mountain road I drove to find the truth. And I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Let me take you back to where it all began. I sat in that cathedral pew during Helena's funeral, feeling like a ghost in my own daughter's life. The church was packed with at least 200 people, but I might as well have been invisible. Daniela, my daughter-in-law, sat in the front row sobbing so loudly that people kept turning to comfort her. My granddaughter Sophia just stared at her phone screen, her face blank as marble. And then there were Rodrigo and Clarice, Daniela's parents, who seemed to be running the entire ceremony like they owned it. They greeted guests, they chose the flowers, they even decided which photos would be displayed. Nobody asked me what Helena would have wanted. Nobody asked me anything at all. I remember thinking that grief makes people strange, that maybe everyone was just processing their pain in different ways, but there was something else nagging at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way Rodrigo kept glancing at his watch during the eulogy, the way Clarice squeezed Daniela's shoulder and whispered something that made my daughter-in-law's tears stop instantly, the way none of them would look me in the eye. For days after we buried Helena, Dr. Santos called me to his office for the reading of the will. I expected Daniela to be there, maybe Sophia too, but when I arrived, it was just me, the lawyer, and a manila envelope that would change everything. Dr. Santos cleared his throat and told me that Helena had left me Vale dos Pinheiros farm, all 300 acres of it, plus the main house and every structure on the property. I sat there stunned, because this made no sense. Why would Helena leave me the one place she had begged me to avoid my entire life? Why would she give me something she was terrified of? I asked Dr. Santos if Daniela knew about this, and he looked at me with this odd expression and said she had been informed but chose not to attend. That should have been my first real warning sign. What wife doesn't show up to hear her deceased spouse's final wishes? I drove home with that rusty key burning a hole in my purse, and my mind spinning with memories. Helena at 8 years old, grabbing my arm with tears streaming down her face, making me promise never to go to that farm. Helena at 16, waking up screaming from nightmares about Vale dos Pinheiros. Helena at 30, changing the subject every single time I asked her about the property she'd inherited from her father's side of the family. That night, I was heating up some soup in my kitchen when I noticed headlights through my window. A black SUV was parked across the street, just sitting there with the engine running. I watched it for 20 minutes. It didn't move. The driver didn't get out. It just sat there like a predator watching prey. When I finally decided to go outside and ask what they wanted, the SUV drove off smoothly, like they'd been waiting for me to notice them. like they wanted me to know I was being watched. I barely slept that night. I kept taking out that old rusty key and turning it over in my hands, remembering Helena's face every time she mentioned Vale dos Pinheiros. There was always fear in her eyes. Pure, genuine fear. Not the kind of fear you fake or exaggerate. The kind that comes from knowing something terrible and true. By morning, I had made my decision. I didn't tell my sister Laura. I didn't tell Sophia. I certainly didn't tell Daniela or her parents. I got in my car alone and drove toward the truth, even though every instinct told me I was driving toward danger. The road to Vale dos Pinheiros wound through mountains and forests for almost 2 hours. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I finally saw that faded wooden sign, Fazenda Vale dos Pinheiros, my heart was hammering so hard I thought I might have a heart attack right there. The iron gate was covered in rust and vines, and it shrieked like something dying when I pushed it open with that old key. I expected to find an abandoned property, maybe some run-down buildings and overgrown fields. After all, Helena had avoided this place for decades, but what I saw made me stop breathing. The farm wasn't abandoned at all. There were new stables with horses grazing peacefully. There were workers maintaining the fences. There were vehicles parked near a barn. And the main house, a beautiful 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, looked like someone had been caring for it lovingly for years. Someone had been living here. Someone had been maintaining this place. And Helena had never said a word about it. I walked toward the main house with my heart in my throat, and that's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. My daughter hadn't been afraid of this place because it was abandoned and forgotten. She was afraid of it because it held secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. I stood on that porch with my hand shaking as I turned the key in the lock. The door opened smoothly, too smoothly for a house that was supposedly abandoned. Someone had oiled these hinges recently. The interior took my breath away. Polished hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon light. Beautiful paintings of horses lined the walls. There was a library filled with leather-bound books, their spines perfectly aligned. In the corner sat a glossy black piano, and on top of it was a photograph that made my knees buckle. It was Helena at 8 years old, her arms wrapped around my waist, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. I picked up that photo with trembling hands and whispered to my dead daughter, asking her what she had done in this place, asking her why she had kept all of this hidden from me. That's when I noticed the laptop sitting on the oak table in the living room. It was silver, modern, expensive, and next to it was a single red rose, freshly cut, with morning dew still clinging to its petals. Someone knew I was coming. Someone had left this here for me to find. My hands shook as I opened that laptop. There was no password protection. The screen lit up immediately, and a video file was already loaded and ready to play. I clicked it, and my daughter's face appeared on the screen. She looked so thin, so pale, dark circles under her eyes like bruises. But it was her voice that broke me. That voice I would never hear again in person. She told me that if I was watching this, she was already gone. She explained about the hereditary heart condition, the same one that had killed my husband. She said that 3 years ago, Dr. Ferreira had given her between 2 and 5 years to live. She hadn't wanted me and Daniela to spend whatever time she had left watching her die slowly, waiting for her heart to give out. I covered my face and sobbed. My baby girl had carried this burden alone, had faced her own mortality without her mother's hand to hold, because she wanted to protect me from the pain. What kind of world makes a daughter hide her dying from her own mother? I was still crying when a gust of wind suddenly whipped through the room. The curtain billowed violently, and I rushed to close the window with shaking hands. When I turned back around, another video had started playing automatically. Helena was staring directly into the camera, and her eyes were different now. There was fear in them, but also determination. She leaned forward and told me there was something worse than dying from a disease. She said she believed someone was trying to make her die faster. She said she thought someone was poisoning her. My blood turned to ice. Poisoning. Who would poison my daughter, and why? Before I could process what I'd just heard, I heard footsteps on the porch. I spun around to find Sophia standing in the doorway, looking around the room with wide, confused eyes. She told me she had followed me, that she'd seen me leave so secretively, and got worried. She wanted to know why I had come here alone. She asked me what this place was and why her mother had left it to me. I didn't know how to answer her. How do you tell your 15-year-old granddaughter that her mother suspected she was being murdered? How do you explain that the heart failure might not have been natural at all? Before I could figure out what to say, the roar of engines shattered the quiet. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. 3 black Mercedes-Benz SUVs were pulling up to the house, kicking up dust as they came to a stop in a perfect line. Rodrigo stepped out of the first vehicle, his face hard as granite. Clarice emerged from the second, wearing designer sunglasses and a cold smile. And from the third came a man I'd never seen before, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that screamed money and power. Rodrigo didn't bother with pleasantries. He told me flatly that this farm didn't belong to me, that I had no right to be here. I pulled out the will and told him it was all legal, all documented, all notarized by Dr. Santos. Clarice laughed, actually laughed, and informed me that paper was just paper, that laws could be manipulated by people who knew how. The silver-haired man introduced himself as Dr. Mendez, their attorney, and began spreading documents across Helena's oak table like he owned the place. He claimed he had contracts proving that Vale dos Pinheiros belonged to an investment fund tied to Daniela's family, that these contracts predated Helena's will, that my daughter's testament had no legal weight whatsoever. He was smooth, confident, using legal terms I barely understood, making me feel stupid and small and powerless. I shouted that they were lying, that Helena had left this to me for a reason, that I wasn't going to just hand it over. But Rodrigo just turned toward the door and told me never to meddle with this place again. His tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. They left in their convoy of expensive cars, and I noticed that one black SUV, the same one that had been watching my house, stayed behind, parked near the gate. Someone was making sure I knew I was being monitored. Sophia grabbed my hand and asked me what was happening, why these people were so angry, why they acted like we were criminals. I had no answers for her. All I knew was that something about this farm was worth fighting over, worth threatening an old woman and her granddaughter over. That afternoon, while Sophia was exploring the horse stables, an elderly man in a worn cowboy hat approached me cautiously. He introduced himself as Miguel, and told me he was the farm administrator, that Helena had hired him 3 years ago to maintain the property. 3 years ago, right when she got her diagnosis, right when she started preparing for her death. Miguel asked if I wanted to see what Helena had really been doing here, what she'd been building in secret. I followed him across the property, to what looked like an old abandoned barn. Inside, he moved aside a stack of hay bales to reveal a trapdoor. He pulled it open to show me narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. He told me Helena had called it her war room. We climbed down into what I can only describe as a bunker. The walls were covered with geological maps and satellite photos. There were filing cabinets stuffed with documents. There were computers with multiple monitors. It looked like something out of a spy movie. Miguel turned on the lights and pointed to the maps on the wall. That's when I learned the truth about why everyone wanted this farm so badly. Vale dos Pinheiros sat on top of petroleum reserves worth billions of dollars, not millions, billions. My daughter had been sitting on an oil fortune, and someone had figured it out, but it got worse, so much worse. I opened another filing cabinet and found laboratory reports analyzing Helena's food samples, test after test after test, all showing traces of cardiac stimulants, substances that would make a weak heart work harder, beat faster, fail sooner. The meals that Daniela had been preparing with such love and devotion had been laced with poison designed to kill my daughter slowly while making it look like her hereditary condition. I collapsed into a chair, unable to breathe. My daughter-in-law had been murdering her. Day by day, meal by meal, Daniela had been speeding up Helena's death so she could inherit everything sooner. Miguel plugged a red USB drive into one of the computers. More videos of Helena appeared, recorded in this very bunker. She looked directly at the camera and told me to be careful, that someone was poisoning her food, that she'd been documenting everything but didn't know who she could trust. She told me she was leaving all the evidence for me because I was the only person in the world she knew would fight for the truth, no matter how painful it was. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Dr. Santos. I told him I had proof of murder, that I wanted to take this to trial, that I was going to make sure everyone responsible paid for what they'd done to my daughter. He was quiet for a moment, then told me to be very careful, that these people had resources and power I couldn't imagine, but he agreed to help me. He said he'd filed the paperwork to challenge the inheritance and demand an investigation into Helena's death. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept watching those videos of my daughter over and over, seeing the fear in her eyes, hearing the tremor in her voice. She'd known someone was killing her, and she'd faced it alone, documenting everything in secret, hoping her mother would be strong enough to finish what she'd started. I was 73 years old, and everyone was going to think I was just a confused old woman who couldn't accept her daughter's natural death. But I had evidence now. I had proof, and I had something else too. The fury of a mother who'd lost her only child to murderers, who thought they'd gotten away with it. They'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated the determination of a grandmother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived 3 weeks later. I walked into that courthouse with Sophia on one side and Miguel on the other, carrying boxes full of Helena's evidence. My hands were steady, my mind was clear, and my heart was burning with righteous anger. Across the aisle sat Daniela, flanked by Rodrigo and Clarice, like bodyguards protecting royalty. She was dressed in elegant black, playing the grieving widow perfectly. When our eyes met, she gave me this sad, pitying smile that made my skin crawl. Dr. Mendez sat beside them, looking as expensive and confident as ever. Dr. Santos presented our case methodically. He showed the judge Helena's videos explaining her suspicions. He submitted the laboratory reports showing cardiac stimulants in her food samples. He called Miguel to testify about the war room and everything Helena had been documenting in secret. But Dr. Mendez destroyed each piece of evidence with surgical precision. He told the court that videos could be easily edited, that my daughter's terminal illness had clearly affected her judgment, making her paranoid and delusional in her final months. He suggested that Helena's hereditary heart condition explained everything, that introducing conspiracy theories about poisoning was insulting to her memory. Then, he attacked the lab reports, claiming they didn't prove who had added the substances or even when they'd been added. He said Helena had been taking multiple medications for her condition, that cross-contamination was possible, that the chain of custody for these samples was questionable at best. I sat there listening to him twist and distort my daughter's careful documentation, making her sound like a confused, dying woman who couldn't think straight anymore. I wanted to scream that Helena had been brilliant, that she'd known exactly what she was doing, but I knew that would only make me look like the hysterical old mother everyone expected me to be. Rodrigo took the stand and painted himself as the devoted family patriarch, who'd supported Helena financially for years, who'd treated her like his own daughter, who was devastated by her loss. He claimed that Valdos Pinheiros had been purchased with Daniela's family money, that his daughter had every right to inherit it, and that I was an outsider trying to steal from his grieving child. He actually called me an outsider. I'd given birth to Helena, raised her alone after my husband died, sacrificed everything to give her the best life possible, and this man called me an outsider in my own daughter's life. The judge listened to everything, asked a few questions, and then made his ruling. He said that given the disputed ownership of the property and the questionable nature of the evidence, he was granting temporary administration of Valdos Pinheiros to Daniela while the investigation continued. Temporary administration, which meant she could access everything, move everything, destroy everything before we ever got to a real trial. I walked out of that courthouse into pouring rain feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Behind me, I could hear Rodrigo and Clarice celebrating, their voices carrying across the courthouse steps, and there, standing with them under a large umbrella, was my sister Laura. My own sister was hugging Clarice like they were old friends, laughing about something while I stood there soaking wet and defeated. Laura saw me staring and had the decency to look uncomfortable, but she didn't come over, she didn't explain, she just stayed there with them. That's when I realized the betrayal went deeper than I'd thought. My own blood had chosen their side. I drove back to Valdos Pinheiros that night, feeling more alone than I'd felt since my husband died. Sophia fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from the emotional toll of the hearing. I sat in Helena's library in the dark, surrounded by her books and her memories, feeling like I'd failed her. The next morning, Laura showed up at the farm. She told me she'd come to support me, that she was sorry about the hearing, that families should stick together in times like these. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe that my sister hadn't betrayed me. But I'd lived 73 years, and those years had taught me to watch what people do, not what they say. During lunch, I noticed Laura typing on her phone under the table, her fingers moving quickly while she thought I wasn't looking. I excused myself to use the bathroom, then quietly circled back and positioned myself where I could see her screen. She was sending a text message that said she was still working on gaining my trust, that I hadn't mentioned anything about new evidence yet, that she was awaiting further instructions. My own sister was spying on me, reporting my every move to them. I felt sick to my stomach, but I kept my face neutral and returned to the table like nothing had happened. If Laura was going to play spy, then I was going to give her exactly what they wanted to hear. That afternoon, Miguel came to tell me that the security cameras in the war room had been hacked, that someone had remotely accessed the system and deleted files. He said Helena's backup drives were missing from the safe where he'd stored them, that someone with inside knowledge had taken them. I glanced at Laura, who was sitting on the porch pretending to read a magazine. She'd been alone in the house for 20 minutes that morning while I was outside talking to Miguel, so I set a trap. I mentioned casually in front of Laura that I'd found another set of evidence hidden in a safety deposit box in town, that I was planning to retrieve it the next day. I made it sound urgent, important, like it could change everything. That evening, I heard Laura on her phone again, her voice low and urgent. She was telling someone that I was planning to get new evidence the next day, asking what they wanted her to do about it. She actually used the phrase, "I'll take care of it," before hanging up. My sister, the woman I'd shared a room with growing up, who'd been my maid of honor at my wedding, who'd held my hand at my husband's funeral, was actively working to destroy my case and protect my daughter's murderers. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the role of the defeated old woman perfectly. I let Laura think she was successfully spying on me. I let Daniela's family think I was giving up. I shuffled around the farm looking tired and hopeless, talking about how maybe I should just accept the judge's decision and move on. But behind that mask, I was learning things. Miguel showed me how Helena had set up redundant backup systems, how she'd hidden evidence in multiple locations because she knew someone might try to destroy it. We spent nights in the war room recovering encrypted files that no one else knew existed. I also noticed things about the people who thought they'd won. Daniela started visiting the farm regularly, her grief conveniently forgotten now that she had temporary control. She walked around like she owned the place, measuring rooms, making plans, talking on the phone about development deals and property values. Rodrigo and Clarice came by to inspect their investment, and I heard them discussing buyers who were interested in the petroleum rights. They spoke openly because they thought I was just a harmless old woman who didn't understand business anyway. Even Dr. Mendez got comfortable, stopping by to ensure all the paperwork was in order. I served him coffee and cookies, playing the gracious host, while Miguel secretly recorded every word he said about their plans for the property. They all made the same mistake. They assumed that because I was old, I was stupid. They assumed that because I'd lost the first round, I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. They assumed that a 73-year-old grandmother would just shuffle off quietly and let them get away with murder. But here's what 3/4 of a century of life teaches you. Patience is a weapon. Underestimation is an advantage. And sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemies think they've already won, while you quietly prepare for the real battle. 3 days before our final court date, something broke in their alliance. I was in the war room reviewing evidence when I heard shouting coming from the main house. I crept closer and heard Daniela arguing with Rodrigo about money, specifically about how much of the petroleum profits she would get versus how much would go to her parents. Clarice was insisting that they'd funded everything that Daniela owed them. Daniela was screaming that she'd been the one to live with Helena, to slowly poison her food for months, to play the devoted wife while committing murder. She actually said those words out loud, her voice shrill with anger and entitlement. Miguel had the camera running, capturing every word. That night, I sat alone in the library and allowed myself a small smile. They'd gotten so comfortable in their victory that they'd forgotten to watch what they said. They'd underestimated the farm's security systems because Miguel looked like a simple ranch hand. They'd underestimated me because I looked like a grieving old woman. Tomorrow, we'd file our motion for a full criminal trial with the new evidence. Tomorrow, they'd learn that their temporary victory was about to become their permanent nightmare. But tonight, I took out that photograph of 8-year-old Helena hugging me and whispered a promise to my daughter. I told her that her mother wasn't as weak as everyone thought, that age had given me patience and cunning that youth could never match, and that every single person who'd hurt her was going to pay. Because the most dangerous person in any fight isn't the one who looks the strongest, it's the one everyone underestimates until it's too late. I filed the motion for a full criminal investigation exactly 1 week before the final hearing. Dr. Santos walked those documents into the prosecutor's office personally, accompanied by Miguel's recordings of Daniela's confession and 3 additional pieces of evidence that Helena had hidden so carefully that even I hadn't known about them. But 3 days later, my world exploded in a way I never saw coming. I woke up to my phone ringing nonstop. News vans were parked outside my house. When I turned on the television, my face was plastered across every channel with headlines that made my blood run cold. Elderly woman fabricates, murder claims to steal inheritance, daughter's deathbed wishes, ignored by greedy mother, family accuses grandmother of exploiting tragedy for money. Someone had leaked our entire case to the press, but they'd twisted everything. The videos Helena made looked like the confused ramblings of a dying woman being manipulated by her mother. The lab reports were presented as questionable at best, fraudulent at worst. Even Miguel's testimony was spun to make him look like a paid accomplice, helping me create false evidence. I sat there in shock, watching my reputation being destroyed in real time. Neighbors I'd known for decades were being interviewed, saying they'd always thought I seemed bitter about not being closer to Helena, that I'd complained about Daniela's family having too much influence. Things I'd said in private moments of frustration were being weaponized against me. Laura appeared on one broadcast, tears streaming down her face, claiming she was heartbroken that her sister had become so consumed with bitterness that she'd invented this horrible conspiracy theory. She said I'd changed after Helena's death, become paranoid and accusatory, that she'd tried to help me but I'd pushed her away. My own sister was on television calling me crazy. Dr. Santos called within the hour. His voice was tight with anger as he explained that someone had illegally accessed our case files and fed everything to a media consultant who specialized in reputation destruction. He said this wasn't just about winning a legal case anymore. They were trying to destroy my credibility so completely that no judge or jury would ever believe anything I said. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store for the first time since the news broke. People stared, some whispered. One woman I'd known from church for 15 years actually crossed to the other side of the aisle to avoid me. The cashier, who usually chatted with me about her grandchildren, rang up my items in complete silence, her face carefully neutral. This is what it feels like to be erased, I thought. They weren't just fighting me legally, they were making sure that even if I won, I'd have nothing left. No reputation, no community, no dignity. But that night, sitting in the war room with Miguel, something clicked into place. I started going through Helena's financial records more carefully, looking beyond the farm and the petroleum reserves. What I found made everything suddenly make terrible sense. Helena hadn't just inherited Veiled Dos Pinheiros, she'd also inherited a massive trust fund from my husband's family that would mature when she turned 45, just 3 years after her diagnosis. The trust was worth over $20 million, separate from the farm entirely. And according to the terms, if Helena died before it matured, it would go to her spouse. Daniela hadn't just been after the petroleum reserves, she'd been racing against time to kill Helena before that trust matured. Because if Helena had lived to 45, she could have changed the beneficiary. Daniela needed her dead before she turned that corner. But there was more. I dug deeper into Rodrigo and Clarice's finances and found something that explained their desperation. They were drowning in debt, millions of dollars in bad investments, failed business ventures, and loans from dangerous people. They needed that petroleum money not just for greed, but for survival. If they didn't deliver on their promises to certain investors, they'd lose everything, possibly even their lives. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about desperate people who'd committed murder to solve their financial problems, and were now willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. I called Dr. Santos and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long moment before telling me this changed everything. That financial motive combined with the medical evidence and Daniela's recorded confession would be impossible to dismiss. But he also warned me that these people were now cornered, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. He was right to warn me. 2 days later, someone broke into my house while I was at the farm. They didn't steal anything valuable. They took photo albums, personal letters, and my laptop. They were looking for anything else I might have found, any other evidence Helena might have shared with me. Miguel doubled the security at Veiled Dos Pinheiros after that. He installed new cameras, changed all the locks, and started sleeping in the barn with a shotgun beside him. He told me he'd served in the military for 20 years, that he'd seen his share of dangerous situations, and that these people had the look of folks who'd already crossed lines they couldn't uncross. Sophia stayed close to me during this time, scared by the news coverage and the break-in. One night, she asked me if all of this was worth it, if maybe we should just let it go and try to move on with our lives. She said her mother was already gone, and nothing would bring her back. I held my granddaughter's face in my hands and told her that Helena had died, documenting the truth because she believed truth mattered more than peace. I said that if we let murderers inherit from their victims, if we let lies win because fighting was too hard, then what kind of world were we leaving for her? But Sophia asked me something that haunted me for days afterward. She wanted to know if I'd ever considered that fighting this battle might cost me everything, my reputation, my relationships, maybe even my life. She asked if revenge was really worth that price. I thought about that question long and hard. Was this revenge, or was this justice? And did the difference even matter anymore? The criminal investigation officially opened 2 weeks before the final hearing. A homicide detective named Inspector Cardoso came to Vale dos Pinheiros to review all of Helena's evidence. He was in his 50s, methodical and quiet, the kind of man who missed nothing. He spent 3 days going through the war room, examining every document, every video, every lab report. He interviewed Miguel for hours. He took samples from the house, the kitchen, even the garden where Helena used to grow herbs. He didn't tell me what he was thinking, but I could see his jaw getting tighter with each new piece of evidence he reviewed. On the third day, he sat down with me in the library and told me something that changed everything. Helena's body had been cremated immediately after the autopsy, at Daniela's insistence. The original autopsy report had concluded natural death from heart failure, and nobody had questioned it at the time, but Inspector Cardoso had pulled the original report and found something interesting. The pathologist who'd performed the autopsy had noted some irregularities in Helena's tissue samples but had been pressured by the hospital administration to conclude the report quickly. The pathologist had written in the margins that she would have recommended toxicology screening, but the family had already authorized cremation, and the body was being prepared. That pathologist was Dr. Ferreira, the same doctor who'd diagnosed Helena's heart condition 3 years earlier. The same doctor who'd given my daughter that terrible prognosis. Inspector Cardoso told me he'd tried to contact Dr. Ferreira to discuss these margin notes, but she'd left the country 6 months ago for an extended sabbatical in Portugal. Her departure had been sudden, and she'd left no forwarding address. I felt ice forming in my stomach. They'd silenced the one person who might have caught the poisoning early. They'd either paid her off or scared her off, and now she was conveniently unreachable. But Inspector Cardoso wasn't finished. He told me that based on the evidence, he was recommending the prosecutor file criminal charges against Daniela for murder. He said the recorded confession combined with the lab reports and the financial motive was enough to proceed to trial. Rodrigo and Clarice would be charged as accessories after the fact. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Someone with authority believed me. Someone with power was taking my daughter's murder seriously. That night, I went down to the war room one more time, looking for anything else that might strengthen our case. I was going through Helena's computer files when I found a folder I'd somehow missed before. It was labeled simply insurance and was encrypted with a password. I tried every combination I could think of, birthdays, anniversaries, Sophia's name. Nothing worked. I was about to give up when I remembered something Helena used to say when she was a little girl. Whenever she was scared, she'd whisper, "Mama's brave." So, I'm brave too. I typed it in, "Mama's brave." The folder opened. Inside was a video dated just 2 weeks before Helena died. She looked worse than in any of the other recordings, gaunt, exhausted, but with a fierce determination in her eyes. She started by saying that if I was watching this, her final insurance policy had been necessary. Then she told me about a safety deposit box at Banco Nacional that contained the original versions of every document related to Vale dos Pinheiros, going back 40 years. She'd discovered that Dr. Mendez had been falsifying property records, creating fake investment contracts, forging signatures on documents that made it look like Daniela's family had legitimate claim to the farm. But Helena had found the real documents, the ones that proved Vale dos Pinheiros had been in my late husband's family for 3 generations, that it had passed to Helena through legitimate inheritance, and that no investment fund had ever had any claim to it. Dr. Mendez had created an entire false paper trail, probably for a substantial fee from Rodrigo and Clarice. Helena gave me the safety deposit box number and told me the key was hidden inside the piano. Inside the piano, not on it. She said I'd know where to look. I ran upstairs to that black piano where I'd found our photograph. I opened the lid and looked at the strings, the hammers, searching for anything unusual. Then I saw it. One of the wooden panels on the inside had been carefully removed and replaced. I pried it up with trembling fingers and found a small envelope taped to the underside. Inside was a brass key and a note in Helena's handwriting. The truth is always worth protecting, even when lies seem easier. I love you, Mama. Finish this for me. The next morning, Dr. Santos and I went to Banco Naciano with Inspector Cardoso and 2 uniformed officers. The bank manager was nervous. I could tell that someone had been asking about Helena's safety deposit boxes, probably trying to gain access. But the law was clear. Only I could open it now. The box was large, and when I opened it, I understood why Helena had called it her insurance policy. There were original property deeds, authenticated by notaries who'd been practicing law since the 1970s. There were tax records showing continuous ownership by my husband's family. There were photographs of the farm from decades ago with my husband standing in front of the property markers. And there was a notarized statement from a retired judge who'd overseen the original inheritance when my husband died. The judge had written that he remembered the case clearly because Rodrigo had tried to contest it back then, claiming his family had invested in the property. The judge had investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of any such investment. That Rodrigo had been trying to defraud a widow and her young daughter. Rodrigo had tried this exact same scheme 25 years ago, right after my husband died. He'd failed then because I'd had an honest judge and a good lawyer. So he'd waited, planned, and when Helena got sick, he'd seen his chance to try again, this time with a corrupt lawyer and a daughter willing to commit murder. Dr. Santos laid out all the documents on the bank's conference table and told Inspector Cardoso this was definitive proof of fraud. Every contract Dr. Mendez had presented in court was fake. Every claim Rodrigo had made was a lie. They'd built their entire case on falsified documents, while the real proof of ownership had been sitting in this box the whole time. Inspector Cardoso made a phone call, and within an hour, the prosecutor's office issued warrants, not just for Daniela anymore. Now they wanted Rodrigo, Clarice, and Dr. Mendez for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and accessory to murder. I walked out of that bank feeling like I was carrying Helena's spirit with me. My daughter had been so smart, so thorough, so determined to protect the truth even as she was dying. She'd known they'd come after her inheritance, so she'd hidden the proof where they'd never think to look. That evening, I sat at the piano and played a song I hadn't played since Helena was a little girl, a simple lullaby I used to sing to her at bedtime. My fingers were stiff with arthritis, and I missed several notes, but it didn't matter. I was playing for my daughter, thanking her for being brave enough to document everything, for trusting that her old mama would be strong enough to see this through. Sophia came and sat beside me on the bench. She didn't say anything, just leaned her head on my shoulder while I played. When I finished, she whispered that her mother would be proud of me. I told her that Helena had been the brave one, that all I was doing was honoring the path she'd laid out. But Sophia shook her head and said it took a different kind of courage to pick up someone else's fight and carry it forward when the whole world was telling you to give up. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was bravery in being 73 years old and refusing to let murderers win just because fighting them was hard and lonely and painful. The final hearing was in 5 days, and now, finally, I had everything I needed to make sure justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise I could actually keep. The days leading up to the final hearing felt like living in the eye of a hurricane. I knew the storm was coming, but everything around me had gone eerily quiet. Daniela stopped visiting the farm. Rodrigo and Clarice stopped calling. Even Laura went silent. No more texts asking how I was doing, no more surprise visits to check on me. They knew something had shifted, but they didn't know exactly what. That uncertainty was eating them alive. Inspector Cardoso advised me to stay at the farm with Miguel for security. He said people facing murder charges sometimes did desperate things, especially when they realized their carefully constructed lies were falling apart. So I stayed in Helena's house, surrounded by her books and her memories, preparing for the battle that would either vindicate her or destroy me completely. 3 days before the hearing, Sophia asked if she could testify. She was 17 now, old enough for her testimony to carry real weight. She told me she had things to say about her mother's final months, things she'd noticed but been too scared to mention before. We sat on the porch swing, and Sophia told me about the special meals Daniela used to prepare for Helena. Meals that nobody else was allowed to eat. She remembered her mother getting sick after almost every dinner, rushing to the bathroom while Daniela cleaned up the dishes quickly, always hand-washing them instead of using the dishwasher. Sophia said she thought it was strange at the time, but Daniela had explained that Helena's medication made her nauseous, that it was normal now. Knowing what she knew, Sophia realized she'd watched her own mother being poisoned and hadn't understood what she was seeing. The guilt was crushing her. I held my granddaughter while she cried, telling her that she'd been a child, that she couldn't have known, that evil people count on good people not recognizing evil when it's happening right in front of them. But I could see in her eyes that she'd carry this weight forever, the knowledge that she'd been in the room while murder was happening and had done nothing to stop it. Dr. Santos came to the farm that evening to prepare me for court. He spread out all our evidence on the dining room table, the videos, the lab reports, the authentic property documents, the recordings of Daniela's confession, Inspector Cardoso's findings. It looked overwhelming, undeniable, but Dr. Santos warned me that Dr. Mendez was one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the country. He said we should expect him to attack everything, my credibility, Helena's mental state, even Miguel's character. He told me the key was to remain calm no matter what they said, to remember that emotion could be used against me, to speak clearly and simply about what I knew to be true. I asked him honestly what he thought our chances were. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that, in a just world, we'd win, easily. But this wasn't always a just world, and wealthy people with connections had ways of influencing outcomes that regular people didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if the judge was in Rodrigo's pocket? What if they'd found some legal technicality to exclude our evidence? What if the jury believed Dr. Mendez's version of events instead of the truth? At 2 a.m, I went down to the war room one final time. I watched Helena's videos again, studying her face, listening to her voice. In one of the last recordings, she'd said something that I'd forgotten until now. She told me that fighting for truth wasn't about being guaranteed to win, it was about refusing to let lies become the official story. She said that even if she died before exposing what Daniela was doing, at least she'd documented it, preserved it, given it a chance to be heard. That was all anyone could do, give truth a fighting chance. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A woman showed up at the gate asking to speak with me. Miguel was suspicious, but she showed him identification proving she was a journalist named Carolina Mendez, no relation to Dr. Mendez. She was quick to clarify. Carolina told me she'd been investigating corruption in property deals for years, and someone had anonymously sent her information about the Vail dos Pinheiros case. She'd dug into Rodrigo and Clarice's financial history and found a pattern. They'd been involved in at least 3 other suspicious property acquisitions where the original owners had died suddenly or been pressured into selling. She wanted to know if I'd let her cover the trial, to publish a full investigation into what they'd been doing. She promised to be fair and thorough, to present all the facts and let readers draw their own conclusions. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid more media attention after how badly the previous coverage had hurt me. But I thought about what Helena had said about truth needing a fighting chance. If Carolina could show the public who these people really were, if she could expose their pattern of behavior, maybe it would help our case. I agreed, but only on the condition that she also talk to Sophia, to let my granddaughter tell her story in her own words. Carolina agreed immediately. That afternoon, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Laura's car was parked down the road from the farm, partially hidden behind a grove of trees. She was watching the property, probably reporting back to them about Carolina's visit. I'd almost forgotten my sister was still playing spy for the other side, so I walked out to Laura's car and knocked on her window. She jumped, clearly not expecting to be caught. I asked her if she was proud of herself, if whatever they were paying her was worth betraying her own blood, worth protecting the people who'd murdered her niece. Laura started crying and telling me she'd made a mistake, that they'd promised her money if she helped them, that she'd been desperate because her business was failing. She said she'd thought it was just about property rights, that she hadn't known about the poisoning until later, and by then she was already in too deep. I looked at my sister, someone I'd loved my entire life, and felt nothing but pity. She'd sold out her family for money she'd probably never even see. Because people like Rodrigo and Clarice didn't share their profits with people they could manipulate for free. I told Laura she had one chance to do the right thing. She could testify about how they'd recruited her, how they'd been coordinating their attacks on me, what they'd told her about their plans. Or she could keep lying for them and spend the rest of her life knowing she'd helped murderers go free. Laura sat there in her car crying, and I walked away. I didn't know if she'd find the courage to testify, but I'd given her the chance. That was more than she'd given me. The night before the hearing, Miguel found me sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the fields. He told me that whatever happened tomorrow, I should know that Helena had chosen the right person to carry on her fight. He said not many people had the strength to stand alone against powerful enemies, to risk everything for truth, to keep fighting when the whole world said to give up. I thanked him for everything he'd done, for protecting Helena's secrets, for standing by me when I had nobody else. He just nodded and said that some fights were worth having, regardless of the outcome. That there was honor in refusing to surrender to evil, even when evil looked like it was winning. That night, I wrote a letter to Sofia, in case something happened to me at the courthouse. I told her that I loved her, that her mother had been the bravest person I'd ever known, and that standing up for what's right was the only legacy worth leaving behind. I sealed it and left it with Miguel, hoping I'd never need to give it to her. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in Helena's library, surrounded by her books, thinking about how this 73-year-old grandmother had somehow ended up as the last line of defense between justice and evil. It seemed absurd. But then again, evil always counted on good people being too tired, too scared, or too old to fight back. Tomorrow, they'd learn that some grandmothers don't know when to quit. Tomorrow, they'd discover that age doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise enough to know what's worth fighting for and stubborn enough to never back down. Tomorrow, Helena's truth would finally be heard. And whatever happened after that, at least I'd know I'd given my daughter's story the fighting chance it deserved. The courthouse was packed when we arrived. Carolina's articles about the case had gone viral overnight, and suddenly everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Camera crews lined the steps. Protesters held signs supporting both sides. The story of a grandmother fighting her daughter's murderers had captured the public's attention in a way I never expected. I walked in with Sofia holding one hand and Dr. Santos holding my elbow. Miguel followed close behind, his presence solid and reassuring. Inspector Cardoso was already inside, sitting with the prosecution team, his face grave and determined. On the other side of the courtroom sat Daniela Rodrigo, Clarice, and Dr. Mendez. They looked pale and tense. Gone was the arrogant confidence from our first hearing. Daniela wouldn't meet my eyes. Rodrigo kept whispering urgently to Dr. Mendez. Only Clarice maintained her composure, sitting ramrod straight with her hands folded in her lap, but I could see her knuckles were white from gripping too hard. The prosecutor was a woman named Dr. Silva, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for taking down wealthy criminals who thought they were above the law. She'd told me privately that this case made her sick, that mothers shouldn't have to fight for justice for their murdered children, but that she'd make sure Helena's story was told properly. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Amaral was an elderly man, maybe 80 years old, with deeply lined face and eyes that had seen decades of human behavior at its worst. Dr. Santos had told me that Judge Amaral was known for being absolutely incorruptible, which was probably why this case had been assigned to him. Dr. Silva began by laying out the timeline of Helena's murder. She presented the medical evidence first. Dr. Ferreira's original autopsy notes with the margin comments about irregularities and the need for toxicology screening that never happened. She showed the lab reports from Helena's food samples, explained exactly what cardiac stimulants do to a failing heart, and painted a picture of systematic poisoning over months. Then she played Helena's videos. The courtroom fell completely silent as my daughter's voice filled the room, explaining her suspicions, documenting her symptoms, begging anyone who found these recordings to investigate her death. I watched the jury's faces and saw their expressions shift from skepticism to horror as Helena described feeling worse after every meal Daniela prepared, noticing the pattern, secretly saving food samples for testing. In one video, Helena said something that made several jury members visibly emotional. She talked about how much she'd loved Daniela, how she'd wanted to believe she was wrong about the poisoning, how she'd hoped right up until the end that the woman she'd married wasn't capable of murdering her for money. Sophia testified next, and my granddaughter was remarkable. She spoke clearly about the special meals, about her mother's constant illness after eating, about Daniela's insistence on washing dishes by hand. She admitted that she hadn't understood what she was witnessing at the time, but now the pattern was undeniable. Dr. Mendez tried to shake her testimony during cross-examination, suggesting she'd been coached by me, that her grief had confused her memories. But Sophia looked him straight in the eye and told him that some memories don't need coaching because they're burned into your brain, like watching your mother die slowly and not knowing someone you trusted was killing her. Then Miguel testified about the war room, about everything Helena had documented, about the security footage he'd recorded of Daniela confessing to the poisoning. When Dr. Silva played that recording, you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. Daniela's voice came through clearly, arguing with Rodrigo about money, saying she'd been the one who'd lived with Helena, who'd slowly poisoned her food for months, who'd played the devoted wife while committing murder. The jury stared at Daniela in shock, and she started crying silently, her whole body shaking. But we weren't done. Dr. Silva then presented the evidence of fraud, the authentic property documents from the safety deposit box compared to the forgeries Dr. Mendez had submitted to the first hearing. She brought in the retired judge who'd overseen the original inheritance, who testified that Rodrigo had tried this exact scheme 25 years ago and failed. She showed the jury Rodrigo and Clarice's financial records, their massive debts, their pattern of suspicious property acquisitions. She painted a picture of desperate people who'd decided murder and fraud were acceptable solutions to their money problems. Finally, Dr. Silva did something I didn't expect. She called Laura to the stand. My sister walked to the witness stand looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. Her hands shook as she was sworn in. And then, voice trembling, Laura told the truth. She admitted that Rodrigo had recruited her, offering her $50,000 to spy on me and report everything I found. She confessed to stealing evidence from my house, to feeding information to Dr. Mendez about our legal strategy, to appearing on television calling me crazy when she knew I was telling the truth. She told the court that Clarice had explicitly told her that they needed to destroy my credibility before the evidence could be heard, that if I looked like a delusional old woman, nobody would believe Helena's recordings. Laura said she'd agreed because she needed the money, and she'd convinced herself it was just about property rights, not murder. But then she'd heard Daniela's recorded confession, and she'd realized she'd been helping murderers. Laura looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said she was sorry, that she'd been weak and greedy and stupid, but that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't tell the truth now. Dr. Mendez tried to salvage something during his defense. He argued that Helena had been mentally unstable due to her terminal illness, that the videos showed paranoid delusions, that correlation wasn't causation. He suggested that maybe Helena had been taking supplements that coincidentally contained cardiac stimulants, that there were innocent explanations for everything, but his arguments sounded hollow, especially after the recording of Daniela's confession. How do you explain away someone admitting to murder, in their own words? Daniela didn't testify. Dr. Mendez wouldn't let her take the stand. Rodrigo and Clarice did testify, both claiming they'd had no idea what Daniela was doing, that they'd simply been trying to protect their daughter's inheritance rights. They painted themselves as innocent parents, caught up in a tragedy they didn't understand. It was all lies, of course. The financial records showed they'd been planning this for months before Helena died. The emails between them and Dr. Mendez proved they'd known exactly what was happening, but they sat there in their expensive clothes with their fake tears and lied under oath. The trial lasted 3 days. On the final day, both sides gave their closing arguments. Dr. Silva stood before the jury and reminded them that they'd heard a dying woman begging for help, a grieving granddaughter describing the mother's suffering, and a confession of murder in the killer's own voice. She told them that justice wasn't complicated in this case. It was about whether they had the courage to hold wealthy, privileged people accountable for their crimes. Dr. Mendez argued that the prosecution had built a case on the paranoid delusions of a sick woman, the confused memories of a grieving teenager, and circumstantial evidence that proved nothing. He said his clients were victims of a vindictive old woman who couldn't accept her daughter's natural death. Judge Amaral instructed the jury, and they left to deliberate. I sat in that courtroom with Sophia beside me, holding her hand so tightly I was probably hurting her. We waited for 4 hours. When the jury returned, the four women stood and announced their verdict: guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree for Daniela, conspiracy and accessory to murder for Rodrigo and Clarice, fraud and forgery for Dr. Mendez. The courtroom erupted. Daniela collapsed in her chair, sobbing. Clarice let out a sound like a wounded animal. Rodrigo just sat there in stunned silence, like he couldn't believe that his money and connections had failed to save him. Judge Amaral sentenced them immediately. Life imprisonment for Daniela, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. 20 years for Rodrigo and Clarice. 10 years and disbarment for Dr. Mendez. Then Judge Amaral did something extraordinary. He looked directly at me and said that he'd been a judge for 45 years, and he'd rarely seen courage like mine, the courage to stand alone against powerful enemies, to keep fighting when everyone told me to give up, to honor my daughter's memory by demanding the truth be heard. He said the court apologized for the indignity I'd suffered during this process, and he hoped the verdict brought some measure of peace. I couldn't speak. I just nodded while tears streamed down my face. Sophia threw her arms around me, and we held each other while the bailiffs led Daniela and her parents away in handcuffs. Laura approached us slowly, her face wet with tears, but I couldn't deal with her yet. The betrayal was too fresh, too painful. Outside the courthouse, Carolina and dozens of other reporters were waiting. I gave a brief statement, saying that this victory belonged to Helena, who'd been brave enough to document her own murder and trust that someone would fight for her. I said that age doesn't make you powerless, it gives you the perspective to know what battles are worth fighting. That night, back at Vale dos Pinheiros, I sat at Helena's piano and played that lullaby again. But this time, I wasn't playing for my dead daughter. I was playing for the promise I'd kept, for the justice I'd won, for the truth that had finally been heard. Sophia sat beside me and asked if I felt better now that they were in prison. I told her honestly that I didn't feel better exactly. Helena was still gone, and nothing would bring her back. But I felt like I'd honored her, like I'd finished what she started, like her death meant something because the truth had been told. Sometimes that's all we can do in this life. Make sure that truth doesn't die with us, that someone carries it forward even when carrying it is hard and lonely and painful. 6 months after the trial, I stood on the porch of Vale dos Pinheiros, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold and orange. The farm was truly mine now. No more legal battles, no more disputes, no more threats. Just me, Sofia Miguel, and 300 acres of land that my daughter had died protecting. The petroleum company had made their offer within weeks of the verdict. Billions of dollars for the mineral rights, enough money to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes, to set up trust funds for Sophia and her future children, to never worry about anything material ever again. I turned them down. People thought I was crazy, of course. Why keep a farm? I was too old to run when I could sell it for a fortune. But those people didn't understand what this land represented. Helena had died protecting it. She documented her own murder to ensure it stayed in our family. This wasn't just property, it was her legacy, her final act of love and trust. Instead, I turned Vale dos Pinheiros into something Helena would have been proud of. With Miguel's help, I converted the main house into a shelter for elderly people escaping financial abuse from their families. There were more people like me than anyone wanted to admit, grandparents being manipulated, stolen from, isolated by children and grandchildren, who saw them as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings worth respecting. The War Room became an evidence preservation center where people could securely document abuse, where lawyers volunteered time to help families navigate elder exploitation cases. Carolina wrote articles about our work, and suddenly we were getting calls from all over the country from people who'd been dismissed as confused or senile when they tried to report being mistreated. Sophia enrolled in law school with plans to specialize in elder law. She told me that watching her grandmother fight for justice had shown her what she wanted to do with her life. She said too many people assume that old age means powerlessness, that wrinkles and gray hair somehow make you less deserving of dignity and protection. She was right, of course. Society treats aging like it's a disease. Like reaching 70 means you're automatically confused, weak, unable to think clearly, or make decisions. People had tried to use my age against me throughout the entire legal battle, suggesting I was too old to understand what was happening, too emotional to see facts clearly, too fragile to be trusted with the truth. But here's what 73 years of life had actually given me: the wisdom to recognize manipulation, the patience to gather evidence methodically, the perspective to know which battles were worth fighting, and the stubbornness that comes from having survived enough hardships to know you can survive one more. Laura reached out several times during those 6 months. She wrote letters apologizing, saying she'd testified against herself at trial and was serving 3 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. She wanted me to visit her, to forgive her, to remember that we were sisters and family should stand together. I read her letters but couldn't bring myself to respond yet. Maybe someday I'd find forgiveness for her, but the wound was too fresh. She'd looked me in the eye and called me crazy on television, while knowing I was telling the truth about Helena's murder. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal quickly, even between sisters. Dr. Ferreira contacted me from Portugal after the trial. She sent a long email explaining that Rodrigo had threatened her family if she didn't leave the country and stop asking questions about Helena's autopsy. She said she'd been a coward, that she should have reported the threats to the police, that she'd been living with guilt ever since. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do now to make amends. I told her to come home and work with our Evidence Preservation Center, to use her medical expertise to help other families recognize the signs of poisoning and abuse. She agreed immediately and returned to Brazil 2 months later. Now she trains doctors and nurses to look for the warning signs that someone might be harming an elderly patient, to trust their instincts even when families insist everything is fine. The verdict had been appealed. Of course, Dr. Mendez's replacement argued that the trial had been tainted by media coverage, that the jury had been prejudiced against his clients, but the appeals court upheld everything. The evidence was too overwhelming, the confession too clear, the pattern of behavior too obvious. Daniela, Rodrigo, and Clarice were exactly where they belonged, and they'd stay there for decades. Sometimes at night, I thought about them sitting in their cells, finally understanding that their money and connections couldn't protect them from the consequences of murdering someone's daughter. I hoped they thought about Helena, about the life they'd stolen, about the pain they'd caused, but I suspected they only thought about themselves and what they'd lost. One afternoon, while I was working in Helena's library, Sophia asked me if I ever regretted fighting so hard, putting myself through so much pain and public humiliation, risking everything for a verdict that couldn't bring her mother back. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I told her that grief never completely goes away, that there wasn't a day I didn't miss Helena, with an ache that went bone deep. But I also knew that if I'd walked away, if I'd let them get away with murder because fighting was too hard, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. Helena had trusted me to finish what she started. She'd documented everything, hidden the evidence, left me a trail to follow, because she believed her mother was strong enough to see it through. How could I have honored her memory by giving up when she'd faced her own murder with such courage? Sophia hugged me and said she understood, that she'd fight just as hard if anyone ever tried to hurt the people she loved. I held my granddaughter close and felt grateful that at least one good thing had come from all this tragedy. Sophia had learned that you don't let evil win just because fighting it is difficult. On the 1-year anniversary of Helena's death, we held a memorial service at Vale dos Pinheiros, not the fake, performative funeral that Rodrigo and Clarice had orchestrated, but a real celebration of my daughter's life. Friends from her childhood came, colleagues from her business came, people she'd helped over the years came to share stories I'd never heard. I learned so much about Helena that day, about her generosity, her fierce loyalty, her quiet acts of kindness that she'd never mentioned to me. One woman told me that Helena had secretly paid for her daughter's cancer treatment when insurance denied coverage. A man explained that Helena had given him a job when he was newly released from prison, and nobody else would hire him. My daughter had spent her life helping people, and she'd died at the hands of someone who'd claimed to love her but had really only loved what she could provide. The cruelty of that contrast still took my breath away sometimes. As the sun set that evening and guests began to leave, I walked down to the old barn where Miguel had first shown me the war room. The bunker was empty now. All the evidence had been moved to the preservation center. But I could still feel Helena's presence there, could still sense her determination and courage in that space where she'd fought back against her own murder. I spoke to her then, told her that I'd kept my promise, that her killers were in prison, that her legacy was protecting other people now. I told her that being her mother had been the greatest honor of my life, and that I'd spend whatever time I had left making sure her death meant something. The wind picked up, rustling through the pine trees that gave the farm its name, and for just a moment, I felt like Helena was there with me, telling me she was proud, telling me I'd done enough, telling me it was okay to rest now. But I wasn't ready to rest. There were too many other grandmothers out there being dismissed and exploited. Too many families where age was being weaponized against the elderly. Too many people who needed to hear that you don't stop fighting just because you're old. This is what I've learned in my 74 years. Strength isn't about physical power, or youth, or even having people on your side. Strength is about knowing what matters and refusing to compromise on it, no matter how hard the fight gets. Strength is standing alone when everyone else walks away. Strength is being told, you're too old, too weak, too emotional, too confused, and proving them all wrong. Helena taught me that. Even in death, my daughter was still teaching me to be braver than I thought I could be. So if you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, if you're facing your own battle against people who think your age makes you powerless, remember this story. Remember that a 73-year-old grandmother took on wealthy murderers and won. Remember that documentation and patience and stubbornness can defeat money and connections. Remember that the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. And please, let me know you're out there. Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know where this story has reached. To know that Helena's courage is inspiring people around the world. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about people who refused to let age define their power. Who fought back when fighting seemed impossible. Because here's the truth that took me 7 decades to fully understand. We don't become weak as we age. We become dangerous. We've seen too much, survived too much, learned too much, to be easily fooled or intimidated. And when someone threatens what we love, when someone thinks they can exploit us because we're old, they're about to learn that wisdom is the most powerful weapon of all. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for believing in Helena's story. And thank you for remembering that justice doesn't have an age limit. It just requires someone stubborn enough to demand it. Vale dos Pinheiros stands as proof that truth can win, that love endures beyond death, and that a mother's promise is stronger than any lie. This was my story. This was Helena's legacy. And this is why you should never, ever underestimate a grandmother who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for.